Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in this evening. I am so glad to be able to have a conversation this evening with Ravynn K. Stringfield. My name is Chinyere, by the way, and I'm a member of Foster for a few months now. So without further ado, let me introduce who our guest is. Ravynn is a Ph.D. candidate in American Studies at William & Mary, and her dissertation project focuses on Black women and girls in fantasy new media narratives. Ravynn is also an essayist and fiction writer, and her creative nonfiction work has appeared in Catapult, Midnight and Indigo, Shondaland and ZORA. And her novel-length fiction is represented by Leah, Pierre, and of Ladderbird Literary Agency. And so I give like a short snippet of all that Ravynn is. And so Ravynn, if you don't mind, please may you share more about who you are. And again, thank you so much for spending your evening with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is always a good time to talk about writing. For me, I really enjoy it, and to talk with other writers about writing. I think as an academic, or rather someone who spends a lot of time in higher education, I sort of like do not claim academics. I really enjoy talking about craft because, in the academy, sometimes it's very much about the findings and less about how you're translating them to other people. And so I really like to talk to other people about the fun things that I'm discovering and learning and analyzing. So this is a good opportunity for me. But that's a lot of what I do. I sort of, a lot of my writing journey kind of starts in graduate school and kind of builds out, because I don't really think about becoming a serious writer until graduate school. And I think it was partially because as I was doing like these peer-reviewed papers and things like that, I was like, I don't actually want to write like this. There are just some conventions that didn't suit me and didn't suit who I was trying to be and the voice that I was developing as a writer. And I found that I was stronger at communicating in fiction and in essays and short form essays and things like that. So that's sort of kind of how and why I end up writing in so many different ways, is because I usually kind of have a question, typically about how Black girls are, like how we navigate sort of seeing ourselves in fantasy narratives, how we navigate not seeing ourselves in fantasy narratives, how do we sort of mediate that? So when there aren't those Black girls to look to in those particular types of narratives, who do you latch on to and why? Like that. So those sort of questions lead me in a lot of different directions. And so I really try to just turn over my inquiries from different vantage points with my different types of writing. I think that sort of answers the question.
Oh yeah, perfectly. I really love that. There's so many things that come to my mind already. And one of the pieces that I read of yours, you define yourself, and also this is the title of the conversation, that's where I got it from, as a point in the constellation, and the point of the constellation of previous Black futuristic writers and those who are focusing on both superhero narratives or comic narratives, or those just in fantasy narratives of itself. If you can, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit about graduate school was that place that helped foster your recognition of your talent as a writer. But can you share with us more of who are those that you reference to as you find yourself, like where actually are you in this constellation, and what are the things that you talk about and things of that sort?
Yeah, I think to answer this sort of question well, I have to think, how long I was doing this sort of like questioning before I came to graduate school. I was someone who loved comics and someone who loved fantasy growing up. Everything from, I was the first one in line with my dad to go see whatever X-Men movie had come out when I was younger, and I even like collected for a while. I collected the comic strips from the Sunday paper that I liked, and I would like put them in a binder together. You know, I loved it without really asking too many questions. Harry Potter, all of that stuff. And then I think when I get to college, right, like there is this French professor who's my advisor, and he sees me several times with stacks of comic books as I'm just coming back from the library, like getting ready to like go order pizza and like just hang out in my room and like read comics. And he sort of kind of asked me about them, like, what are you doing? Like, da, da, da. And I was telling him, and I was sort of like, I guess probably waxing poetic about the comics, right? Like, like doing a lot with it. And he was like, it sounds like you could study this. Like, it sounds like, you could study this sort of thing. And I thought he was joking. I thought he was like pulling my chain. Like, I had never heard of anyone in their entire life studying comics. I was like, that is absolutely not a true thing. That could be true. You're lying. So, he convinces me to do an undergraduate thesis. And at that point, when I'm still a French major, so of course my focus is on Francophone graphic novels. And now that I have the space to like really, really dig deep into the stuff that I had been consuming for like years, right? I was like very, very confronted with the fact that there were absences, right? Like where was I? Like, where were the Black people? Where were the Black girls? If they were there, how were they represented? What kind of stories did they get? All of these sort of things. And those absences, as an undergraduate, I think probably the best thing that I did was, just sort of say, these are the absences and not really do anything about them. So of course it's not until I get to grad school that I start finding different scholars and writers who are writing into that absence, who are writing into the lack, and doing a little bit more than just identifying that it exists. And so for me, early on, the people I was first in conversation with, I think probably like who were talking about Black studies in particular and Black women. I think the first one that I was in conversation with was Deborah Whaley. She wrote Black Women in Sequence. And it was this really fascinating study about all of the different types of Black women that appeared in comics kind of early on. So I learned about, Jackie Ormez and the Butterfly, and like people in not just the characters, but also Black women illustrators and writers in comics that had a longer legacy than I was realizing. From there, it became, very clear that I could follow it out. And I also realized quickly that, I'm in American studies, but I think what happened was that there were a lot of Black women in particular who were writing about the comics and fantasy and these sort of things, but they were hidden. Like they weren't gonna be in any sort of like typical American studies syllabus, right? You kind of had to go digging, right? And they weren't necessarily in American studies. So like Deborah Whaley, I think, is in English. And then from there, I found Ebony Elizabeth Thomas in The Dark Fantastic, and she's in education studies. And there are sociologists who have studied, like Eve Ewing, right? Like, so I was finding them in sort of different places. And really, it was just because, that somebody that I start with would make a reference to Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, or they would make a reference to Eve Ewing, and I would go check them out, right? Like that's sort of how that happened. But I mean, and that's like the scholarship end of it. I don't know if you want me to talk about like, who I've sort of come to be or feel like I hope to be in conversation within essays and fiction. So
yeah, I think so. Now I'm just like, there's so much more. I definitely want to know more about you. I didn't know that French was your major. And okay, so I'm not going to, and the recording is going on right now. So let me not speak my broken French, but I'll talk to you later in French. Okay, but that's so cool. And so now that just this makes me see even more how multifaceted your mind is as well too. Many worlds combined into one and thinking about how they all intersect. As you have been digesting over those who you look up to in their writings, in the works that they do, and even in their own intellectual like sectors and such, how have you now been able to solidify or be in the works of solidifying Ravynn's voice? You are echoing the voices of those who have gone before you, but how have you now added your own unique touch to that?
Yeah, and I want to say, like, first of all, that's very much still in progress. I think in a lot of my writing, I am so reverent of a lot of the writers that have come before me, writers and scholars alike, that oftentimes my first draft, the first comment I usually get across the board from anyone that's editing my work is, "Where are you? Like where, you know, like you have," and they're like, "I know you have that really strong voice." But I also see you wanting to make sure that you pay homage to the people that have like inspired you, but like, where are you? Where is your voice? And so, you know, I say that to say it's actually very difficult still to, you know, I think I've gotten a lot better at honing my voice. And I think, you know, one of the things that contributes to something like that is owning your own experience, and sort of like your positionality, and saying like, the way that I grew up and the way that I experienced the world informs the way that I think about these things. And that's like where that comes from. And when you're unafraid to sort of like, you know, I think, you know, for me, it's very much like, you know, I was a nerdy Black girl, and like, you know, kind of like on the, you know, was on the one hand very smart, but like wasn't necessarily geeky. I kind of hid that. Like it was kind of like, you know, I liked it, but it wasn't like my defining characteristic, right? Like my defining characteristic was that I was smart. And so like, I think I'm at a point in my life now where I'm owning the fact that like I've always been like this. There are just moments in my life where I have prioritized maybe like trying to do something to like tone it down a little bit, because there's so many, you know, spaces in which me being a loud, really abrasive, but also geeky, but also kind of awkward Black girl, this is not like, it's not the move. Like people don't want to deal with it, you know, like they don't have time for my mouth or like whatever I'm gonna say. And so, you know, there are moments when, you know, I have tried to like be less. And I think, you know, in trying to undo that, like, and I'm trying to like undo the sort of necessity of making myself smaller to make room for everyone else, you know, I have just insisted on, you know, taking up as much space as I want to, because I do have stories. And so I think, you know, part of the voice thing too is I think layered in like racialized gender things, right? So what I'm getting at here is I'm thinking about how so much of me still trying to hone my voice is me undoing years of being told that like my voice didn't matter, or like, or maybe not explicitly, but like implicitly, there wasn't space for me. There, you know, people didn't want to listen to me. So those sort of things. And I'm, you know, I think part of coming into your own and your voice is realizing that not only do you have something to say, but there are actually people who really want to hear it. And that is also a stunning a stunning revelation for someone who kind of scrolled away my words for a long time and wasn't even sure I was going to try to be a writer.
I mean, just even if we were to stop right now, that just feels so powerful. In so many ways, can I resonate with what you were saying of feeling, though perhaps it may not have been explicitly told to my face, but just feeling like I have to shrink myself in some parts for, myself to be quote unquote digestible for others. And in reality, whether our own, you know, we have the freedom to write or the freedom to express ourselves or the freedom to do, frankly, whatever it is or say whatever it is and take up as much space as we need to. And that of itself is so liberatory. Um, and so hearing that from you, I'm like, oh man, I think this is good enough for now, but we have more time. So let's go from there.
Okay.
So we kind of, resonate together on this aspect of being both in academia and also being Black women at the same time. How have you now been able to transfer all that you're, doing and learning as your PhD candidate right now, and all your studies, and transfer that into easy readings for your audience? Now, we're not going to be reading citations, and we're not going to be looking at, footnotes and et cetera, but we do want to know about what you're researching, and how do you then switch your tone and have your mass audience be able to tune into what you're actually studying right now?
So I've actually realized that, I don't write like an academic. I don't switch my tones. Like it's one of those things where I realize, really the only difference between like maybe my creative nonfiction and my academic writing is that my academic writing will be in a journal, will be in a peer-reviewed journal or in a like peer-reviewed book or whatever. And there's a little less anecdote, a little bit more analysis or whatever. It's longer. But in terms of tone, I don't do much with changing my tone, because I realized maybe a few months ago, a year ago, that my audience is not necessarily academics. Like even when I'm writing academic stuff, like I realized, for me, audience is everything, right? Like knowing who you're writing to changes how you write. It was mind blowing to me. So, once I realized that my academic pieces, I feel like are about Black girls to advocates of Black girls. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's, specifically Black women or, whatever, but anyone who's like in the business of like trying to support Black girls, whoever that turns out to be, any sort of feminist or whatever, like you're trying to bring that into your praxis. Like that's who I'm writing to with my academic pieces. And then everything else, like my creative nonfiction and my fiction tends to go a little bit, leans more towards, just generally, young teen girls to, whoever's reading, right? But that changes, but the tone doesn't. The tone, I think I found my voice, right? Like I found sort of the way that I write, and I found a rhythm and a cadence through lots of practice that really resonated with me, and that I think most of the time, depending on what I'm writing about, it really enhances, I think, my pieces. I tend to go for sort of a lyrical sort of prose style that I think matches the beauty of what I'm trying to capture, right? Like I'm trying to capture this like really beautiful essence of Black girls that's really soft and delicate, and also like very, like, you can't ignore it, right? Like I think my style tends to be very sort of grabby at times, especially my fiction. I like my agent sometimes is like, okay. But so that is primarily, I think, how I moving in terms of tone, but translating, if your intended audience, like who you have in mind, is a particular subset of people, you don't actually need to do much translation work, right? Like if you know, I think there are people, if you're interested in, Black women, or if you're interested in like Black digital studies, no matter who you are, I like to believe that you could read my work no matter where it is, in any academic pieces or, creative nonfiction. I like to believe that. I hope that that's true. And if it's not, I'll keep working. That's what I aim to do. Like I aim to be the type of writer that like, you know, everything is interesting, everything is valuable, and not a type of situation where, I only, like I read Ravynn's, fiction or whatever, but like can't do that like long essay stuff, and I look to people like Eve Ewing, Roxane Gay, Tristan McMillan Cottom, who like can do, who like, it's different types of writing, but you can read all of it, right? Like you could read Ghost in the Schoolyard, you could read take another essay, it doesn't matter what you're reading from them, all of it is them. It's just the methodology or like the method is like a little bit different.
Yep, that part. And that's the part of when you're in your lane and getting more confident of, yes, this is my voice and this is my style, and then everything just like ripples after that. I really do want to highlight and hear from you about your recent academic publication that you had a few months ago with the essay that, if you don't mind sharing with us what that was and your input into the entire book there.
Yeah, that was, so I had a small essay in alternate histories of the digital humanities. So I'm in American studies, but there are lots of different ways to be an American studies scholar. And one of my particular interests is, not just Black girls in literature, though, I sort of come from thinking about like literature. I also think about, all of the different ways that narratives exist. So not just in literature, but in film and in TV and web series and like on Twitter and like, however and wherever we exist, right? Like I love sort of thinking about that in that way, wherever you can make media, wherever you can make stories. And so my work as a digital humanist is like honestly very similar to everything else that I do. I'm just like, why are Black girls creating stories or crafting stories in this space in this way? Like it's, what is that about? And oftentimes it's very self-reflective. So like, in that particular piece, which is a very small essay, it's just a couple of pages, breaking and remaking the digital humanities. I really am just sort of talking about like how like Black people, particularly Black women, sort of go into the digital humanities and just sort of, break it really, truly. Like they're just coming in, they're like, we're doing digital humanities, but we're not doing it like, this isn't your mama's digital humanities, basically. And so it's sort of like, I'm very interested in the way that like, and I think about that as a type of remixing. I think of it as a type of, like a very, like a digital form of this very specific type of Black cultural practice, right? Like remixing goes back to hip hop, which goes back to, like there's ways to like take it all the way back. And so what we're seeing is just a digital iteration of things that have existed for like a long time. So that's sort of like what the piece is about, like, where I see digital humanities going, if we're paying attention, like as a field, like where I see that going, if we're paying attention to these people that are, breaking it apart, because ultimately we break it to make it better, right? Like that's my assumption or my thought about how, we approach digital humanities, Black digital humanities anyway. And so that is just like a really tiny essay that ended up being a like part of a roundtable afterward for the volume that was edited by Dorothy Kim. she like inherited it from somebody else. But Dorothy was my race and digital humanities teacher at this like digital humanities summer camp that I went to a couple of years ago. And then she reached out and was like, hey, we could really, you know, use your voice in this like afterward roundtable. And so, yeah. And I think also, you know, one thing that I just will mention about that, because I didn't really have much input or, you know, in the rest of the volume, but I did work with the people that were in that tiny section. You know, I partially stay in Black digital humanities because Black digital humanities is kind of like where the misfits go, like the people that don't really fit anywhere else. The digital humanists are like, we'll take you. and so you know, I love them, and they really they're very supportive of my work, no matter where or what it is. You know, they're like, she's our people. And so that is, you know, really valuable for me. Yeah, and if you want to read that essay, it's open access, which just means like you won't hit a paywall if you like click the link to go read it. It exists at Punctum Books if you're interested.
Awesome. So now that we're talking about books and learning, of course, we want to know more about the syllabus. So from learning more about you, you did design a course and superheroes. Can you tell us just a few of the books that you would recommend for somebody who's listening right now and saying, okay, well, let me go ahead and expand my library, say I'm new to the field. What are like the core reads that you'd recommend? And what did it feel like also being on the other side of now teaching to others some of the things that you focus on the daily?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I'll start with like saying, you know, about like teaching this. It's really weird being like a Black girl nerd professionally. I will say that it's a little weird. But you know, I enjoy it in terms of, you know, the class. So long time ago, when I first was like getting into like my graduate studies and things like that, and thinking about these things very seriously, I designed a course that I taught at the University of Virginia called Superheroes in Society. Now, caveat, that class was not very good. Partially because it was my first time teaching. I didn't really have a handle on the critical readings surrounding comic studies at the time. I just knew that like I found like a couple of things that sort of fit with what I was doing, but I didn't really have like a firm grasp on like comic studies as a field. But I knew there was something there. Like this was years and years ago, so I knew there was something there. I think as I have evolved as a scholar and a thinker, as someone who, you know, thinks about comics. So I think one thing I'm going to recommend is if you're someone who's like totally new to the field, and or maybe if you're an academic, we in the academy tend to have very rigid ideas about who and what counts as a scholar and scholarship, right? And that really bugs me because there's some really excellent comic histories that exist. One that was like a gateway drug to me was Tim Hanley is a Canadian comics historian who has written a series of books on like all of my favorite people. He did one on Lois Lane, which is like a whole nother thing. We can talk about that later. Like I love Lois Lane. Lois Lane, Catwoman, Wonder Woman, and then Betty and Veronica. Like he's done a series of like comic histories on them. So if you're interested in like women in comics, you know, I would check out Tim Hanley. Now, once I started like very seriously thinking about like Black people and Black women, the people in books that became very important to me were again Deborah Whaley's Black Women in Sequence. Black Women in Sequence is actually very good if you're trying to learn terms of the field. She's a very like meticulous definer. Like she's very good at defining terms. Like I appreciate her for like being able to sort of give that structural overview of the field in that way. Like she's very useful for like that foundational stuff. And then I think the other people that I would turn to, I really like everything that Sheena Howard does. I think for her, she just dropped Why Wakanda Matters, which is a really cool book to check out. And then Kiana Whitted, who is, I think, I actually don't know where Kiana is. But you know, I had to think about that. But she edited a volume, Comics in the United States South, which was really, really important and influential to me. I'm trying to think who else, because there are a lot of good, especially for Black comic studies. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So actually, here's what I'll do, because I can't think of them off the top of my head. So there you have. I'm gonna give you two options. I can either send you like my comic studies list. So like I did a exam list on comic studies, so I have a list just of comic studies texts.
Oh, wow.
So like if you would like to like learn more, like I can definitely send that to you. It also exists on Black Girl Does Grad School, which is my blog where I have been blogging grad school since 2016. So if you go to blackgirldoesgradschool.com, go to comprehensive exams tab, I think, and then drop down, it'll have my list. There's a page with just all of my books, like on the website. So they exist if you want like a reference page.
That's awesome. So yes, we'll definitely be checking that out. Also, trying to now expand more broadly, how, you mentioned it earlier about exerting your own voice while also honoring and giving homage to the ones who have gone before you. For all the writers, creatives, artists, however you all define yourselves listening right now, Ravynn, what would you recommend for someone who, for someone who has now solidified their own niche, but is trying to go ahead and now identify a gap? So they don't just want to reiterate what's already being said or whatever is, already being done, but how can they both blend the old and then insert themselves as the new?
Yeah, actually, I think the first thing that comes to mind, which may seem counterintuitive, is to find your writer group, like your people, right? Like, you have a specific, community of writers that you start to build, right? Like, because that I think was like the opening, right? So for me, I ended up doing this theater piece when I was a last year of my college experience. And it was called The Black Monologues. And I was like on the writing team. So I contributed a couple of pieces. It was like the first time I had ever in my life really shown anyone, in my adult life, shown anyone my writing. And so, that experience gave me people who then came back to me and were like, so when are you gonna like do some more writing? Like, what do you like? I would like to know your thoughts on like X, Y, and Z thing, because you wrote that really cool piece, and so I'm sure you have something to say about this. Or like, this comic just dropped. Like, are you gonna write something about it? And like, it was in those moments that I realized that there were people out there who really wanted to hear what I had to say. And so that, and like, it was a small audience, right? Like, it was like just a small group of people who like were very consistently, very regularly like reading my blogs and stuff. But it was enough to like keep me going, right? Like they like wanted to hear it. And I had to, it gave me permission to stop belittling myself and stop saying like, this is just a rant. I'm just like ranting to my roommate or like whatever about this like very specific thing that like nobody cares about. I promise you, there is somebody who wants your rant about whatever it is that you're passionate about. I promise you. And I think that's like the number one thing that I have learned in this experience is just that there is an audience for you. You know, and I think finding your voice, or, you know, finding your community, you know, it's about finding your strength, right? Like, it's about finding your sea legs. And I think that doing writing in community is a good way to do that, because you have something to fall back on, right? It's very easy when you start out, if you're going it alone, if you get a rejection, to just like put it in your back pocket and like decide that you're not going to do it again. If you write in community, and there are people to hold you accountable and like want to know how things have gone, you get a rejection, you know, you have somebody to commiserate with, but then in 2 weeks they're going to ask you, have you worked on anything new, right? Like that. Sometimes you like, yeah, it's about being self-motivated, but like also like, I can't emphasize the number of times I wanted to just not be a writer anymore. And I've had one of my friends who I still like, from Black Monologues, who I still write with, like my, you know, like one of my best friends in the entire world was from Black Monologues. You know, she, when I tell her now that I'm like, I don't want to write anymore, she's like, yeah, okay. All right. So when your 36 hours of like feeling sorry for yourself is over, let me know what you're going to write next. And I'm like, that's rude, but like, also I will let you know, you know, like it's, exactly. You know, so, you know, I think that's my advice, is to find your people. And it's hard. It's really hard. I will admit. Like, I was lucky because I found that community while I was in college, where it's very easy to find like little niche groups or whatever going on in college. Once you're like outside of places where like that sort of stuff is already kind of like organized for you, it's really difficult to like find your writing community. But groups like Foster and like, you know, there are lots of different types of groups out there that you can sort of investigate, that I think are a good way to like find your way in. You don't have to like contribute your heart immediately. Like, you can work your way up to it, but like joining a writing group is the first step to like putting yourself out there. Like, or finding people with whom you can share your work is the first step to like, you know, really finding your voice. Because honestly, sometimes you're really not going to know until you have to try it out. You can't be afraid to try it out, right? Like, and it's scary and hard, but absolutely do it, because it's so rewarding.
This would be the perfect segment to have like an advertisement for Foster co-writing. So the podcast will just edit that in. No, I'm kidding. But it's such a wonderful point, though. You do not have to do this on your own. And better yet, even when the times do get difficult, it's so much easier then to know that you have someone or something to lean upon and give you the 36 hours to like, you know, mourn and weep, but then like get yourself together kind of thing afterwards. One of the things I also want to know more from you is also you are the co-host of the Dreaming in the Dark podcast, and season 2 is coming out, so please check that out and support her. How did that begin, and can you share with us more about this podcast and what you do there?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I was working on my dissertation like in the early stages, and one of the people who I was working with, she was telling me that she had this student that graduated a couple of years ago, and she did her undergraduate thesis on like Afrofuturism or like whatever. She couldn't really remember like what the specifics were, but she was like, this sounds sort of like what that girl was doing. And I was like, okay. So she sends me her undergraduate thesis. I don't really read it, but then maybe a couple of months later, I like come across this like very familiar looking name of a Black really popular bookstagrammer who who went to William and Mary and does Black fantasy. Like that's her thing, right? And I was like, So I did some investigating, realized that the undergraduate thesis that I had belonged to this girl. Her name is Desi. And so I reached out to her. We started talking. I went back and I read her thesis, got really excited. We made a plan to chat. We talked for like 3 hours, and we were like, this would be such a cool thing to like do a podcast about this, because we both were like had scholarly lenses, because she went on to go do her master's at Georgetown, continuing to like ask questions about Black fantasy. And so we both had this sort of like William and Mary connection. We both had this very like serious interest in like thinking about fantasy and Black people in fantasy from a scholarly perspective, but also as fans and consumers of this type of work. And for me also, I write fantasy, right? Like I write, I've written short fantasy. I've written a novel length fantasy that like I have since like put on the shelf, but like, I do write fantasy. And so we decided that we like that day we were like, we're gonna do a podcast. And it was out the next month. Like we reached out to a couple of people that we knew. Like she has, some contacts in publishing because she's a bookstagrammer. So she like reached out to a couple of authors that she knew. I reached out to a scholar, my agent, and my friend Micah, who was kind of like dabbling in speculative in her films, because we wanted to talk about it. And we wanted to talk about fantasy, not just in books, right? Like not just in stories, but like the way that fantastic elements in some ways becomes a part of Black culture, right? Like in different types of ways. And we take the name of the podcast from Toni Morrison's Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, right? And Toni Morrison, if you read Playing in the Dark, she is actually not interested in having her work classified as speculative or as fantasy or any of that. But it's conflicting with if you read something like Beloved, or like there is a sort of speculative aspect to Toni Morrison's work. She's just not interested in it, right? And so that got us thinking about the ways that there are these fantastical elements to Black life that just are inherently there, right? Like not anything that we've gone out of our way to imagine, but even if you look at our folk tales, like Zora Neale Hurston has cataloged like the High John the Conqueror folk tales or whatever, and High John is like riding on the waves of sound, or like the way and everyone's like, yeah, cool, the people could fly, like they just grew wings, flew back to Africa, cool. And we just like accepted like that's that's totally our thing. And so Betsy and I were like super interested in these questions and like these thoughts and these provocations and the ways that it exists in media. So we started the podcast. The first season went really well. It's all really available on Anchor.fm. So if you like want to check that out, it exists. There are links to it everywhere. But we're launching season 2 on Wednesday. So we have a star-studded lineup. I can't say anything about who we've got this season because we haven't announced it yet, but trust me when I say I geeked every single interview. So it was really fun. And we just like wanted to talk about it from so many different perspectives. Like I've been sort of advocating for this entire time, is that like, when I have a question, I like to turn it over a lot of different ways. It's not just literature. It's also in music. It's also in TV and film and web series and like the combinations of those things that exist. And, I found in Desi an intellectual partner who also likes to turn things over from very, very many different perspectives. And so there's so many ways to be a fan of Black fantasy, and we just wanted to celebrate them all.
That is so cool. As So just even thinking about that, and then just thinking about all that we just discussed right now, for our audience right here, please feel free to drop in any questions that you have, and Ravynn will be here to answer them. And on my end, I have just a few more questions left, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Um, as you have been going along, and you've solidified in your own voice, you solidified and kind of just like your lane, right? What would you now say to somebody who is trying to find those publications that are best suited for their own voices, right? So they're now no longer going to shrink themselves, now no longer going to dilute themselves, but they also need an outlet to share their work. What would you recommend? How are the lens that they can go ahead and look for them, or look for the places, and all of that such?
The number one advice I give is to read very widely. And so this is also like, it's not actually as hard as it seems. One of the tactics I often recommend for people is like, think about like when you're just scrolling through social media, like if you're on Twitter or something, or you just like are on the internet just scrolling, where are the pieces that you normally stop on? Like, do you, like, if you stop to read something, or if a headline grabs your attention, where is it normally posted? Like, is it in the Atlantic? Is it in the Washington Post? Is it on like smaller literary magazine? Like where are those titles that grab your attention? After that, I also sort of like, I like to see where people who I admire from like Twitter or other places, where else are they publishing? I've gotten really good at reading bios in like literally everything. Like I actually really love reading bios of people who have written books or in literary magazines or whatever, because they often, like if I like someone's style, their bio tells me where else people would also like that style, right? So if I see myself in like somebody else's writing, I might try, the other 3 literary magazines that are in their bio, right? Like that's sort of like how I find new places to explore, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's conflicting advice you can get on beginning to like branch out and start to publish. I mean, take this however you will with many grains of salt, but I tend to be really loyal, and I have sort of an allegiance to small to mid-sized journals where I get a lot of editorial attention. And I know that might sound like kind of weird or whatever, but like, sometimes like I've realized that like as a writer, I really, really value good editorial work. And so I, for example, had a really, really good experience with the editor at Catapult for one of my first big literary pieces. And like the level of like detail and attention that Mallory Healy put into my essay was just like mind blowing. And then they wanted to continue to work with me. Like they made it very obvious that like, Catapult was a place that I could continue to pitch, right? Like it wasn't just like a one-off, like, oh, we have something to like put in the magazine. Like they wanted to build a relationship with me. So like now, like I've taught a class with them. I've written like 5 essays for them. I like read for the Slush Pile. Like I like love Catapult. Like and I love places that love me, right? Like it's so easy for people to just be like, we want to do a Black Voices issue. And then they like collect your piece. They don't edit it. They just put it in, and then you never hear from them again. Like, it's like we wanted to have something to show for like Black History Month. That sort of thing. And so I really value places where I will get that like really good editorial attention, or where I feel an allegiance to the people that are working there, or a kinship with them. I'm much more likely to do things based on like care than I am based on like clout or whatever. Like I'm like for example, like just as a short example, like I've wanted to publish something in the Atlantic for years. And the first time I sent a pitch was like a couple of weeks ago because I didn't know anyone on like any editors who I felt I, could be sure that I would have a really good relationship with. So I, having a name, having a byline doesn't really, I'd much rather have like a quality piece, that got really good care, than, just like a random like New York Times piece that like the editor was really mean to me or like or something like that. So yeah, read widely. That's sort of like how I would recommend going about it. It's just sort of like seeing where you naturally pause on articles when you like are scrolling through social media, and sort of like lightly stalking your favorite writers and just like seeing where they where they publish, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's what I recommend.
Awesome. I love it. So Ravynn, if you don't mind, please share with us where we can find you on our lightly stalking journey of you. Anywhere we can connect with you, how we can support your work and support all that you're doing.
Yay. Okay. So I have lots of links and all these sort of things, but you can find me, most of everything else that I will say to you is on my website. My like personal author website is Ravynn K Stringfield at RavynnkStringfield.com. So like my literal author name, like first name, middle initial, last name.com. And so other things that like I write and that you can follow, like all of my writing, you can find on the clips page of my website. But I also have kept, I think I mentioned this at some point during the conversation, Black Girl Does Grad School, which is my formerly weekly blog, now more like a whenever I remembered to write something blog. But it was very like religiously updated for the first maybe like 4 years of my grad school journey. So I would go over there like to see some of my like older writings and how I like sort of see the evolution of Ravynn's writing style. If you want to connect with me on social media, I'm unhealthily on Twitter. So like you can follow me at at Ravynn Chinyere, RavynnKamia. So that's where I am on Twitter. That's also where I am on Instagram. And as if I don't have enough things to do, I also like to draw. So you can also find me on Instagram at Ravynn Creates, RavyNN Creates. If you want to see pictures of pretty Black girls having fun and being joyous. I have an Etsy shop related to that Instagram page that I have closed because at some point I realized I was doing too many things, and so it's on vacation. But it does exist, and it may be back in the future sometime. But I think that's it. If you want to send me an email, feel free. My email is on my website. I think at the very bottom of the first page.
Well, Ravynn, I just want to say thank you so much for spending your evening with me. This is so awesome just to listen to and talk with you. And I don't want to speak to the audience, but I'm pretty sure they enjoyed it as well too. So like you said, we can connect with you on your website and hear more about your work and read more about what you publish. And all the best to you in your journey. And thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Thank you.